the next presentation is from Marie-Claude Gervais of Versity. The title of the presentation is Attitudes to the Blind, a study commissioned by the Royal Institute for the Blind. And Marie-Claude will share with us how Versity helped the RNIB truly understand public attitudes to the blind in a project that later influenced their entire organizational strategy. That has to comfortably fit under the heading of a successful outcome. Marie-Claude, I'm now going to hand the controls over to you. So you have center stage. Can you hear me? Very well.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for that lovely intro, and thank you, Dan. And it was a lovely first kind of opener. I'm going to talk to you today about research for RNIB, but maybe it's a good idea to say a few words about Versity first, because many of you will never have heard of us. So we are a research and consultancy agency that specializes in research with people who are seldom heard in research, so minority groups and vulnerable people in particular, with a view to promoting inclusion and reducing inequalities, but also helping brands and organizations be more successful. So today I'm going to talk about work that was commissioned by RNIB and Guide Dogs, but the focus is really on how the insights changed RNIB in particular. So for those who, some of you actually might have worked with us in the past, this is a very quick overview of the kind of client experience that we have. It's worth saying that we really cut across the statutory, corporate and charity sectors in an almost kind of even sort of way, 30% each, more or less, and work across the piece from customer or audience or patient insights to new product development and customer value proposition testing, assessing brand perceptions, developing communications, the whole works. So the problem that RNIB had at the time, to quote them, was that RNIB needed to change from being a traditional Victorian charity that had been around for 150 years, involved in directly supporting blind and partially sighted people themselves, towards being a modern charity acting as a catalyst for change, an organization that could empower blind and partially sighted people to help themselves, as it were. Now, they also knew that from research with blind and partially sighted people, for short, I'm just going to say blind because otherwise it gets a bit cumbersome after a while. But they knew from research with blind people that from their perspective, the biggest problem in their lives was not their impairment, so much as it was public attitudes towards them acting as a barrier. So they wanted to change something about these attitudes, but they first needed to understand what they are, how big a problem that actually was in reality, and how deeply ingrained, of course, the attitudes were. So that was the brief, to understand public attitudes towards blindness and people who are blind or have a vision impairment. Now, methodologically, this was a bit tricky because actually blindness is not a topic that most people deem very relevant in their lives. It's also, as with disability in general, it's a kind of topic where you're likely, if you ask people directly, you'll elicit socially desirable answers. So people will tell you what they assume you want to hear, what the morally correct position should be, but that's not really what their attitudes are. And also because with all the best will in the world, we're not always aware of our own attitudes. So we felt we needed to combine somehow a way of tapping into both conscious and non-conscious attitudes. So with this in mind, we combined two different approaches. The first one was an online research community, which itself combined a whole range of methods. There were about 25 different methods. We had 42 people that were just members of the general public who specifically did not know anybody who was blind or registered blind as a friend or a colleague or a relative. We spent 10 days with them for about 20 minutes a day, exploring their attitudes and experience and knowledge about blindness. And after we analyzed all of this, we took some key insights that we then tested at scale with a representative sample of 1,000 people with whom we did some implicit association tests. So that's basically testing at speed, testing the speed at which people associate different concepts. And the assumption is that if the speed is slower, it's a more complex cognitive association to make. If people are very quick at making a link between two concepts, it's because it's a natural association for them. So what did we find? The first thing is, perhaps not surprisingly, that in the absence of any meaningful contact with blind people, ignorance is rife, and people rely a lot on assumptions and prejudices because they don't have the opportunity to test that out against reality. And also that people think of blindness as living in complete darkness, as the complete absence of vision, when in fact only 7% of people who are registered blind have no sight at all. And importantly, for an organization that aims to support people with blindness, blindness is seen as congenital, so a disease that you're born with or you're predisposed to getting, and it's therefore deemed a bit unpreventable, which is not useful in terms of trying to support people. So one of the activities which I'll draw on quite a bit in the online community that we used was to get people to draw a blind person. And this particular drawing is quite representative in that you have somebody who's miserable, sad, who feels lonely, isolated, living in complete darkness, cut out from the rest of the world, and unable to see, feel, understand the meaning of the world around. And that was very typical of the kinds of drawings that we got and of the discussions that we had. For example, we also asked people to write down their associations, the 30 words that spontaneously came to mind when they were thinking about blindness and blind people. And the most common associations were to do with darkness and dark. So it's consistent with the image that we just saw, that kind of bubble of darkness in which people live. But then there were also other themes around, I guess, the markers of the identity of blind people, how we know that somebody is blind. So they're reading Braille, they're using a guide dog, they are using a white stick, a cane, they're wearing dark glasses, etc. Then we had other themes around people who are blind, like Stevie Wonder, Ray Charles, David Blunkett, Al Pacino, various people, who's not a real character, obviously, but if you've seen Scent of a Woman, you'll know what I'm talking about. Then many associations that have to do with the loss of independence, the inability to do things. So words like help, unable, can't, dependence, reliance, that kind of fits that. Or even words like TV or driving, it's usually I can't, it's blind people cannot drive, cannot watch TV, simple things like that. Then emotions around what people assume blind people would feel like. So lonely, sad, scared, frustration, panic, angry, happy, anxious, struggle, despair. So it's very gloomy, and there's not much that's positive. And the other, maybe more neutral associations are to do with other senses like smell, sight, hearing, that we'll see in a second. Blind people are assumed to rely more on and to compensate for the loss of sight. So looking at this wealth of evidence, and there was survey data in there and group discussions, we found what seemed to be 4 underlying archetypal ways in which people, the general public, perceive blind people. And so an archetype is a kind of a deep-rooted societal construction that might be rooted in some universal unconscious, if you are young, in terms of which people perceive reality. So the first one in the left-hand corner is the archetype of the innocent. So this is a very good drawing to portray this image of blind people as as gentle, obedient, childlike, a bit vulnerable. And as an archetype, that evokes, if you start thinking about blind people as innocents, it evokes a response of paternalism and protection. Another archetype that was frequent was the victim. Now, the victim is the person on the right-hand side who says, every day is so hard, why do so few people help me? So this image of blind people as tragic, helpless victims of some kind of terrible misfortune is more likely to evoke pity and the desire to help. And then you have on the bottom right, left-hand corner, the superhero, or the hero, which evokes more admiration. So here you've got somebody who is deemed very brave and independent and out in public, and relying on superhero strength, you know, relying on feeling and hearing and being very attuned to their environment. So that evokes admiration for the bravery and the courage and the resilience of the blind person. And then you have a very different type of archetype, which Jung would have called the everyman. Sorry for slightly sexist language, but everyman is the ordinary person, the person like you and me. And it's an archetype that enables us to empathize, to feel some kind of common humanity, to stress common aspirations between, in this case, blind people and the general public. And that invites inclusion and on an equal footing. So you might not be able to see the speech bubbles to read what they say, but it's things like, I wonder if England will win the World Cup, or I love listening to grime music. So it's very ordinary concerns that have nothing to do with a handicap, a disability, and impairment. So that everyman evokes empathy, and it's a much better relationship. It makes it more difficult to justify making reasonable adjustments, but it's a more productive archetype. So we've done all this work, and then one of the things that struck us was that there seemed to be an inability for people to consider so for members of the public, to consider that if you're blind, you can work. So what we did in the implicit associations, this is complicated, you definitely not need to look at all the little percentages. What matters here is that a green, and the more vivid the green, the stronger the positive association. A red color is, versus a pink, which is a milder association, but a red color is a strong negative association, and a gray is neutral. So as you can see in the circle, we compared 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different conditions or impairments or disabilities. So of various different types, from depression to asthma to deafness to blindness, and asked people to make these quick associations with 16 different work rules. Of all of those, the only job that members of the public could conceivably assume a blind person to do was being a musician. And so that brought, and then you had something a bit more kind of a gray area around being a politician, a counselor, a managing director, which I think can attribute to the power of David Blunkett having role modeled the very different way of being blind. And of course, for musicians, it's Stevie Wonder and Ray Charles and Jose Feliciano, and the blind musicians we can all think about, but nobody could think of a doctor, a personal trainer, etc. So clearly there was some education work to be done there. Then we also, it seemed from the online community results that members of the public couldn't imagine blind people being outdoors in the public domain. And indeed, this is what we found in the implicit association test. It is quite scary to me that on the right-hand side, it's only negative association. And the only one that is not a negative association is that blind people are perhaps, possible to imagine in a church or a place of worship. In every other context, it's a negative association. And what a contrast with, people who are deaf, for example, where it's much more varied and complex and variegated. But for blind people, it's all bright red. Now, one of the questions that emerged as the project progressed was whether blind people are actually considered other. Now, it's an interesting question because I used to be a lecturer at the London School of Economics in social psychology and taught a lot about otherness and the other and what that means. So otherness is really what happens when your point of difference marks you out as somebody whose entire identity is going to be spoiled, blighted by that point of difference. In this case, disability, it could be, or blindness, but it could be mental illness, it could be having spent time in prison, it can be being a divorcee, all sorts of things could conceivably spoil your identity. Now, it's one thing to be different, it's another one to be other, because then the process of changing public attitudes towards somebody who's deemed other is much more complicated. So we tested the extent to which the public considered blind people to be just different or other, and it's quite remarkable that despite all the negative assumptions and the prejudices and the limited archetypes that we just discussed, in fact, people don't consider blind people to be fundamentally other. They just think that there are things that they cannot do, and with a bit more empathy, they're prepared to, it's possible to change these attitudes through enhancing empathy. I could talk you through how we arrived at that conclusion, but it's less important, I think, for now. I want to focus maybe a little bit more on the impact of the work on RNIB. And so it is. So the first thing, a little bit like in Dan's research, what it helped do was to provide a very clear strategic focus. So suddenly, RNIB, I think really saw very clearly that their role was not to just help people who are blind, but to equip them to help themselves. So they developed a whole program of work around equipping individuals. Another one which was about empowering blind and partially sighted people to help one another. So that's the whole kind of community empowerment. And the third strand of work was going to be changing society. So playing an active role in breaking down the barriers in society to equal participation for blind people. The archetypes were really helpful in different ways because people in the room were very bright and very thoughtful and caring and reflective. So they asked themselves really questions about their own beliefs as an organizations. And I think many came to the view that maybe they themselves, they're not just members of the general public, saw blind people sometimes as innocents or victims. And therefore, that the organization might perpetuate a more kind of paternalistic approach. So that the research then emboldened them to approach blindness or blind people as everyman, and that galvanized them into thinking much more about how as an organization they could give individual personality and humanity to blind people in their communications and genuinely equip people to lead independent lives and not to become dependent on the organization. So here we begin to see the impact of Versity's work on the rebrand, not just the strategy as a kind of organizational, more internal matter, but the public face of the organization. So because the research had found that the public thought about blindness as having no sight at all, as being congenital and basically based on ignorance, and people had negative attitudes, the strapline became see differently, to emphasize the fact that blind and partially sighted people themselves see, but differently often, but to encourage the public to see differently. And they used in the logo, the typeface, the font that is used in optometrist or opticians charts to kind of symbolize the notion that we can get our eyes tested. So that that new kind of logo and strapline really built on the insights from the research. And then they had a big communications campaign that specifically challenged stereotypes or archetypes and played up the whole everyman person. So I'll give you a minute to digest the ads because I think they're fantastic. So I don't get out much, don't blame my site, blame Love Island. So they're real people who want to watch the same TV shows, who want to go to the same bars, who want to sing karaoke like everybody else. So it's about seeing the person and not just the impairment. You can see the everyman archetype shining through all of this. The research also found that the general public never ever, apart from Helen Keller, who's long dead, can think spontaneously of a blind or visually impaired woman. So it's always men, and within that, as we saw, it's one politician and a number of musicians. So, but these people are absolutely essential and influential in shaping the whole perception that people have towards blindness and blind people. So that encouraged RNIB to think about who would be the next role model that would really help complexify public attitudes towards blindness and blind people. What else? I think that's probably it for now, if we want to have time for discussion.